What's going on, everyone? So as I'm sure you may have noticed if you have followed my reviews for some time, it's that I have not reviewed an IEM in a while now. I've kind of been slacking on the review game. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them just has to do with the fact that I picked up an Elysian Annihilator 2023 about 6 months ago. So kind of one of my Grail IEMs, and by comparison, everything has just sounded a little bit boring to me. Now, with that being said, I was browsing my Instagram a few days ago, and I noticed that CrinEars was releasing a new IEM called the Daybreak. So, I figured, oh shit, I better get my ears on that. It's been a while since I've heard something, and I could also use it as an opportunity to talk about maybe why I am not as excited about a lot of new IEM releases these days. So I did what I usually do. I hopped on over to Super Review's place, and I picked up a few IEMs that I will be sharing my impressions of today. Now, as you guys know, I don't really care about, the physical stuff like the fit, the build quality, the accessories, or anything of that nature when it comes to my reviews. So if that is something that you're interested in, I would highly recommend heading over to Super Review's channel, where he has comprehensive reviews of every one of the IEMs that I'm going to be talking about today. So first, let's talk about the CrinEars Meta. I think this came out back in March, but I finally had the opportunity to listen to it. And I think just in general, it illustrates, why I'm not as excited about IEM releases these days. Now, what I'm going to talk about next doesn't really have to do with the new Meta specifically, but it's more of a general commentary on the state of the IEM market when it comes to the more cheap stuff. I think that 4, maybe 5 years ago, a lot of products that were coming out onto the market, they lacked direction. A lot of them were honestly pretty shit. But you did, because of that, have some diamonds in the rough. There was stuff that was genuinely good and stood out from the crap. But that's not the case these days. Most IEMs these days, they follow a target curve of some sort, or at the very least, they follow common tuning convention. And there are pros and cons to this. For one, if you are a new person entering the hobby, this is a great time to be in the hobby. You can buy an IEM now for like $100 that performs on par with a lot of the IEMs that were $400, $500 only several years ago. With that being said, a natural drawback of this shift in the market towards, standardized target curves and a more homogeneous sound in general is that it stamps out creativity. There are not as many diamonds in the roughs as there was before. There is not as much, IEMs that inspire feelings when you listen to them, at least to my ears. And I think a really good way of summing this up is just with a very common saying you might have heard before, which is that if everyone is special, no one is special. But enough ranting, let's talk about the sound of the Meta itself. So again, this is an IEM that kind of follows the new Meta tuning with some added sub bass under 200 hertz. So yes, the bass on this is very controlled. I don't think it even goes into 200 hertz. I'm pretty sure the shelf cuts out at around like 160 hertz or so. That's where it slopes off into the lower mids. And then you have quite a lot of presence under that as well. In terms of like the intangible qualities of the bass on this, I honestly find it to be pretty soft. When you listen to the attack, it's just kind of like blurred over, especially on anything with quicker beats. At the same time, I wouldn't say that this is unpleasant at all. So I think the best way of describing this bass is that, it's like for me, for example, I wear glasses normally. I'm wearing contacts right now. But sometimes if I'm not wearing my glasses and I don't have my contacts in, and let's say I see like a pretty girl, for example, I might think that they are actually prettier than they really are, than I would think they are if I had my glasses or my contacts in. It's kind of like that, where like, it sounds pleasant overall, but it's kind of by virtue of it being defocused. It's not something that I want to pay attention to. Okay, so moving upwards, let's talk about the mid-range on this. As you might expect, you have pretty flat lower mids from around 200 to 1000 hertz. And then from 1000 hertz to around where the pinna notch is at 3K hertz, you have what is pretty traditional now of this target curve, which is kind of a scoop in that region from 1 to 3K hertz. This is not something that was on a lot of, I don't know if you want to call it old Meta IEMs, but basically what this does is it kind of promotes a greater sense of space around vocals, where the drawback though is that it kind of sounds like vocals lose body and they kind of lose the sense of soul behind them. So honestly, this is really not my favorite tuning decision. And to pull off this kind of tuning decision, I think, at least in my experience, what you really need is a very, very good treble response. You need an extended and fairly, not necessarily like flat treble response, but it does need to be very well extended. And to make this sound good, the level of, like good I'm talking about needs to be at the level of like the Subtonic Storm or the Elysian Annihilator. Those are basically the only two IEMs that I've heard with this kind of recession from 1 to 3 kHz that can kind of pull it off. Those frequencies in the treble, they kind of create that little bite, that upper edge to vocals, especially female vocals when you're listening. It creates that extra sense of realism and depth to them. And if an IEM is not able to hit those frequencies, what you end up with this 1 to 3 kHz recession is just an inoffensive mid-range, but an inoffensive mid-range that is quite boring and kind of dull. So yeah, pretty safe mid-range, just not to my taste in terms of the implementation. Now, something that I want to comment on that was brought to my attention by my friend FC Construct is this idea that as the rest of the frequency response from under the mid-range and under, the more neutral it is, the more aberrations like peaks, dips, and valleys in the treble response, the more those will stand out. And because of that, you really need to have the treble response dialed in. And when it comes to the Meta, I would say it doesn't do the worst job of this. It's quite relaxed from like 5 to 6 kHz, and I don't really hear it as having too much peaking at around 8 kHz, which is a very common resonance frequency in the ear. However, it does have a little bit of peaking past like 10 kHz or so. It's not the worst I've heard again, but it's definitely there, and it makes the treble sound a little bit distinct from the rest of the sound, like the mid-range and the bass. Okay, so what do I think about this IEM overall? I think that it's pretty decent sounding, for one, despite all my nitpicks. Most of my nitpicks that I'm pointing out, again, are to illustrate my problems with the new Meta. But yeah, like I was saying, mostly nitpicks, and it's a pretty decent sounding IEM overall. It's quite safe. Would it be my first pick at $250? Probably not, but I think it's a decent addition to that, that space in the market. Okay, I do want to talk about this though, the KiwiEars KE4. And the reason for that is that when it comes to value, the KiwiEars KE4 is an IEM that makes me kind of question the Meta's value at times. And the reason for that is because I was listening to the KE4 and the Meta side by side, and I was pretty surprised by the differences or the lack of differences between the two IEMs. The most noticeable difference between the two IEMs is that the KE4 has more mid-bass, and that also alters its treble response a little bit compared to the Meta. And I do think they do have like slight differences in their treble responses as well, but it's mostly going to be negligible for most listeners. They sound very, very close outside of that difference in the mid-bass where the KE4 has more, and it lends to a warmer listen for the KE4. Now the thing is that the KE4 is actually $50 cheaper than the Meta is. Now that's not to say that the value of the Meta is non-existent or anything like that. I do think that the Meta does work better for a lot of tracks. It just depends on what you listen to and what your tonal preferences are. So the question that you kind of need to be asking yourself is whether you want a warmer, more bassy, more coherent IEM in the form of the KE4, or whether you want an IEM that is less bassy, slightly more technical in the form of the Meta. I don't really think that there is a right or wrong answer between these two IEMs. It's mostly just going to come down to your tonal preferences and, of course, your budget. Okay, so let's talk about the latest release, which is the Daybreak. So I think this one comes in at $170, so it's a bit cheaper than both the KE4 as well as the Meta. So generally speaking, I find that the Daybreak adds back in some of the excitement that I thought was missing from the Meta as well as the KE4. And it does this through a number of adjustments to its tuning. The first of which is going to be its rise from 1 to 3 kHz and that pinna gain. So it adds back in some of that energy in that region. So the other difference is going to lie in the treble response of the Daybreak. Compared to the Meta, it definitely has more of a distinct peak at around like 11 or 12 kHz. And what this does is it's a bit of a double-edged sword, On one hand, it's going to lend to more like technical performance. It sounds like this has a more textured presentation versus the Meta does. And on the other hand, though, it lends kind of a metallic tinge to the overall timbre of this IEM. And this is kind of like the focal stuff, especially the clear, which has a peak at around 11k hertz. It's kind of like that, just not to the same degree. Like this treble peak, it does also make the bass sound a little bit more sharp. Everything just sounds a little bit sharper on the Daybreak versus the Meta. And I think that's a good thing. At least for me, I like a sharper sound where, you know, like it just sounds more dynamic and you're getting more engagement. However, this treble peak just bothers the crap out of me. I heard it and instantly I was like, okay, is there like another driver handling the treble specifically, like some sort of piezo driver? And then I hadn't seen the specs up until this point, or I just hadn't paid attention enough to know what the specs were. But yeah, it turns out it has a microplanar driver. I'm not saying it's the driver itself doing this, but it's the resulting frequency response. It just sounds very distinct in the treble versus the other frequencies, and it's even more so compared to the Meta, which I already felt like had a kind of distinct treble response compared to the rest of the IEM. Okay, so my conclusion on this IEM is that I would not take it over the, like my benchmarks at this price point, like the Etymotic ER2XR or the Tanchjim Hana 2021. I honestly just prefer those IEMs over this IEM because they have more coherent presentations. With that being said, I could certainly see some listeners enjoying this IEM if they are looking for a more textured dynamic presentation a la the, you know, Focal headphones. Not a bad IEM, just not really to my taste. Okay, so let's finally talk about the TruthEars Pure. I think this is like the successor to the, oh shit, what was it called? Oh, okay, I remember now. It's called the Hexa. Yeah, so this is kind of like the successor to the Hexa, I believe. And honestly, I think these sound like shit. Okay, they don't sound like shit, but they're like really sleepy sounding is the best way I can describe them. Compared to the Hexa, they have added mid-bass. They just have a larger bass shelf in general. And I think that would be fine. The issue is that the extension on these IEMs, the treble extension, is just awful. It legitimately might be worse than the Hexa, which I already thought had really bad treble extension. And when I say treble extension, they have like kind of like a valley between like 10 to 15k hertz, I think. And then in addition to that, they just have a very relaxed region from 5 to 10k hertz. So you get this sound that's just like, just very dark, dull, and just not inspiring at all. Like way less inspiring than even the aforementioned Meta or any of those IEMs. Yeah. So I mean, I guess it's not like the worst thing in the world. Like it's a very safe sounding IEM, and if you're someone who likes to listen loud, then yeah, sure, maybe these could work. With that being said, I think that you could do much better for this price. Like if you want an alternative flavor of sound that I think is really good at this price, I would look at like the Just Ear Defiant. That's an IEM that is just, in my opinion at least, categorically better than this in terms of sound. Granted, again, it's a very different flavor of sound. It's much brighter, more, you know, U-shaped kind of. But then even for cheaper, like something up this alley, I would much rather prefer something like the 7Hz 02. Again, it's tuned a little bit differently, but I think it's just tuned overall a lot better. And it's like, I don't know how much the 02 is, honestly. It's at least like half the price of this. Or you could also just go for like the ER2XR or something like that. I don't know. I just feel like there's so many better options than whatever this is. Okay, and I think that's going to do it for this little roundup of reviews. Thanks so much for watching. I hope it was interesting. And hopefully this explains why maybe I am not as excited about some of the recent releases that have been hitting the IEM world. With that being said, I am going to be doing my best to get back up to date, and I will be going to CanJam SoCal in like a month from now, where I will be getting impressions of all the new IEMs that have come out, and I'll probably make a video of that too if I get a chance. Peace out until next time.